Welcome back. The new world of work, according to Jeremy Arolis, simply repeats asymmetrical power relations and inequalities that characterize current work activities. The changes, he says, only exacerbate even further disparities, inequalities, and precarity in employment. As we witness the unfolding of sharpened gendered, racial, and class inequalities across labor markets globally, with women bearing the brunt of heightened economic precarity, in a context of interconnected health, socio-economic, and climate crises, we convene this morning's session of the Gender and Development Forum of UNCTAD 15 to contemplate the future of work. I am Ambassador Dr. Halimah DeShong, Senior Lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, NITA Barra Unit, and I also serve as the second Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the United Nations. Previous panels have indeed situated the purpose of the Gender and Development Forum, which is to probe the intersections of feminist analyses, macroeconomic and trade policies and practices with a view of creating equitable and just strategies for development. Today, we are privileged to feature a conversation with an esteemed expert panel to focus our thinking around the gendered implications of key shifts in labor markets in the form of increased precarity, the rise of the gig economy, e-commerce, and artificial intelligence, and the related erosion of unionization. We are pleased to be joined by the Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD, Isabelle Durant. Ida Blanc, she is the Secretary General of the National Union of Domestic Workers, NUD, Trinidad and Tobago, and she will share her expertise on precarity, domestic and low-income workers. Ida's experience and expertise span several decades of leadership and activism to secure domestic and other low-income workers' rights nationally, regionally, and internationally. We are also joined by Sofia Scasserra, and she will focus on the changes in the world of work in Latin America. She is an economist and has been working on trade and technology issues in trade for the trade union movement since 2008. She's currently an associated researcher at the Transnational Institute, and she teaches at the National University 3 de Febrero and is an advisor to the Argentine Senate. Our next presenter is Anita Gurumurthy, founding member and executive director of IT for Change, where she leads research on the platform economy, data and AI governance, democracy in the digital age, and feminist frameworks on digital justice. Anita serves as advisor and expert on various bodies, including the United Nations Secretary General's 10-member group in support of technology facilitation mechanism, the Paris Peace Forum's Working Group on Algorithmic Governance, Save the Children ICT 4D Brain Trust, and Moderator Tech and Policy Labs Board. Anita will provide us with her analysis of the future of work and the relations between e-commerce and gender-just economies. Rounding out the discussion on the future of work is Halimah Espino of the Interdisciplinary Center for Development Studies, Uruguay. She is former director of the Institute of Economics of the Faculty of Economics and Administration of the University of the Republic, as the Interdisciplinary Center's coordinator and for their development and gender area. We welcome Halimah's expertise on artificial intelligence and the future of work. An interactive dialogue will follow all 5 of the 10-minute presentations that our panelists will provide. I wish to begin by giving the floor to DSG Durant.
The future of work concerns us all. To ensure an inclusive future, gender must be part of the discussion. And in this spirit, a warm welcome to this session of the Gender and Development Forum of UNCTAD 15. Several trends set the tone for the future of work, most notably that the future will be more digital. This trend is, of course, well underway. Nevertheless, the digital revolution has redefined the way we work and function. Digital services are increasingly the key for successful participation in global value chains. The trend has been propelled further by the COVID-19 crisis as much as our lives moved online, teleworking, online schooling, telemedicine, to name a few. There has been a strong uptake in digitally enabled activities, and we have seen a strong shift towards e-commerce. The pandemic has been hugely disruptive and will have lasting change on how we work, produce, consume, and interact. But currently, digital opportunities are highly concentrated. The United States of America and China account for 75% of all patents related to the blockchain technology, 50% of global spending on the Internet of Things, more than 75% of the cloud computing market, and as much as 90% of the market capitalization value of the world's 70 large digital platform companies. This concentration gives these two countries enormous power, and it deepens the digital divide. We also know that there is a strong gender component to the digital divide. Men have better access to technology and digital opportunities. To build a future of work that is more inclusive, we need to ensure that countries and women and men equally have the required skills, infrastructure and regulatory frameworks to participate in the digital economy. UNCTAD is deeply committed to support countries and the international community in tapping the potential of the digital economy and e-commerce for development and to use it as a force to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. UNCTAD established the E-Trade for All initiative, through which we support assessment of national e-commerce environments, foster collaborations between national and international stakeholders to maximize synergies and advocate for relevant policy approaches. E-trade or e-commerce is also an interesting tool for women empowerment in the developing world, as it allows to bypass more traditional bottlenecks and constraints women face, such as access to banking services. I also want to highlight our E-Trade for Women program. With this program, we support women digital entrepreneurs with adequate skills, networking opportunities and advocacy so that they can become influencers of the digital policy. Another important aspect of the digital future is that the digital economy will be about data. This means that digital data will be increasingly the good or material traded. And it is critical that developing countries will not be more providers of raw data that have the capacity for transform data into intelligence and thus repeat benefits. This goal must be that developing countries are not solely consumers but also producers in the digital economy. In sum, we must foster a digital revolution which is a development opportunity rather than a process that deepens the divides. The dynamics of the digital economy may also contribute to another aspect of the future of work, less stable and more flexible work arrangements. On one hand, this development is a concern as less stability is associated with more precarious work. In much of the developing world, employment is largely informal, and even more so for women. For instance, in Africa, 90% of women work in the informal sector compared to 83% of men. This means that they do not benefit from social protection, which is critical in times of crisis of all age. The COVID pandemic laid bare the vulnerability that comes with informality, and the income of women working in the informal sector fell by 60% during the first months of the pandemic. Precarious work of women has been a long-standing issue. Take the care economy, for example. That's a sector, care work, often happens informally and is predominantly provided by women. If women's contribution to all types of care work were taken into account, global GDP would increase by $11 trillion. If care work were provided through formal channels, millions of women would have much better access to social protection. It is high time we do justice to women's work. Erosion of formal employment will also lead to ending power and labor unions. Unions have contributed importantly to better labor conditions in many sectors and countries. On the other hand, increasing flexibility can also create some opportunities. If we look at younger generations, there may be particular appreciation of more flexible work. The growing gig economy comes to our mind. What does this mean for the future? It could mean different things. We certainly need pragmatic approach of that. We need, of course, to train current and future generation in flexibility, creativity, and digital and transferable skills so that they can operate in evolving work environments. At the same time, we need to pay attention to what flexibility means in terms of statute, labor condition, income, recognition, and career opportunities. Flexibility should not imply full deregulation or total informality. With this, I wish you a fruitful exchange, an exchange of ideas during this fantastic session.
So Ida, I invite you to make your presentation on precarity, domestic and low-income workers.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here to represent my organization, the National Union of Domestic Employees, which is a registered trade union. We were registered as a trade union since 1982, starting mainly to deal with the issues of domestic workers, to organize them. And later on, we have now low-income workers within our fold. So our membership comprised of housekeepers, caregivers, ironers, gardeners, store clerks, drivers, loaders, women on the production line in factories, salesperson, merchandisers, cleaners, all those workers who work for the minimum wage. They are all covered under the minimum wage law in our country. So because the low-income workers, our big problem is that domestic workers are not recognized as workers. But the low-income workers are recognized. And because they are recognized as workers, the union could handle their grievances that may arise. In particular, if they were wrongfully dismissed or retrenched, if their terms and conditions of employment were unilaterally changed, but not so with the domestic workers. They are only covered under the Minimum Wage Act and the Maternity Protection Act. So they can be fired at the whim and fancy of their employers without any means of recourse. If the work becomes redundant after taking care of children, they are sent home without any means of compensation for their years of service. So with this pandemic creeping up on us, everything changed in the way we carry about our business. All our plans for 2020 and beyond had to be changed. We now have to host meetings to handle workers' grievances through virtual meetings. We have to host webinars to keep workers abreast of new developments in the world of work. And we now have to communicate with our membership through virtual membership meetings to hear their complaints. And a lot of low-income workers do not have access to smartphones. So it is mostly the younger workers who have these phones and who can use it. The lockdown measures affected our membership badly, is affecting our membership badly, with members complaining that they could not leave their children unattended at home because the childcare centers are closed and are still closed. They had to choose between the welfare of their children or their work. Members were calling the union and asking for solutions. They depended on us. We had to find answers. We communicated to the Ministry of Labor and we were advised for workers to request pandemic leave, even though there was no legislation for the pandemic. The then Minister of Labor spoke out on pandemic leave for workers, but it was shut down. We advised workers how to communicate with their employers. In some instances, they requested their vacation leave and they got it. But after it was finished, they still could not turn up for work because childcare centers were not allowed to open. Some of these workers are still home. Some have returned to work after arranging with other family members to take care of their children whilst they were at work. A lot of workers lost their jobs. Some complained that their working days were reduced, leaving them with less money to take home to manage their lives and their family members who depended upon them. In some instances, both husband and wife were both sent home with no means of a livelihood. The employers of domestic workers were now asking them to sleep in, and they were worried of losing their jobs because most of them could not sleep in because they had their unpaid work at their homes to perform. Family to feed, children to prepare for their online classes at mornings. Then there were those who had to stay at home because the childcare homes were closed, so they could not go out to work. Employers of caregivers were demanding that workers stay in and work 3 days, doing double shift and 3 days off. But they are not paid for overtime for working the double shift, working both day and night for three days. The COVID-19 pandemic is still here with us, and we continue to advocate and bring to the forefront the problems and difficulties workers are facing in the workplace. We have been highlighting for years the exploitation being faced by workers at the hands of employers who refuse to abide by the labor laws, and they continue with impunity. NUD has been advocating for years about the exploitation of low-income workers, which has been falling on deaf ears. Now this pandemic has made this exploitation visible. Most of our members have complained that they are unable to receive the government's salary relief grant, which was given to workers over a 3-month period, because their employer never paid their national insurance contribution. They also expressed their difficulty to access the Social Security grants, the food cards, rental assistance, etc. In a media release, government indicated that they were surprised at the amount of workers who were not covered by the national insurance scheme in our country. Many of them, that is workers depending on family abroad, who assisted them in helping to make ends meet. That help is no longer forthcoming because they themselves have been sent home from work. Workers have to face eviction because the renters are saying they have to pay the bank. So there is no sympathy for them, even though they have been renting for years and paying on time. Being fired with no means of redress is unjust. Enacting legislation but allowing impunity for employers who violate the law, with workers who feel they cannot speak out for fear of being fired, and refusal to give workers their just dues is exploitation of the worst kind. Given that domestic work takes place in private households, and there are no comprehensive national accounts of the total number of household workers and their contribution to the country's gross domestic product, domestic work has been categorized as invisible work. It is imperative that our call for domestic workers, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but throughout the Caribbean, to be recognized as workers under law and in practice in countries where they continue to go unrecognized as workers. We want to see the labor laws in the different Caribbean islands harmonized and workers moving freely through the Caribbean to work and live in peace, which would decrease the number of human trafficking. We were able, as an organization, to give out over 300 hampers on a monthly basis for 3 months to workers who lost their jobs and whose working days were reduced. Workers who did not lose their job contributed to the hampers, bringing foodstuff but the majority was funded by the International Domestic Workers Federation. So there was a lot of solidarity among the membership in these times of COVID. We even contributed a small stipend to 12 women to start small business, some making cakes and pastries, others making burgers for sale, and other bottled juice. One member bought and sold vegetables. She set up on a table at the side of the road to sell. Members started kitchen gardens and one made seasoning for sale. But then the second lockdown came and they all had to close up shop. Until last week, some places were allowed to open. And next week, hairdressers and barbers will open. Restaurants are still open, but bars are still closed. Now workers are complaining. And why I call these different establishments is because there is where we have our membership. Now workers are complaining that they are now forced to take the vaccine. Some workers have different theories on why they should and should not vaccinate. After working on the production line and not adhering to social distancing, a lot of workers got COVID and were sent home and isolated. So the big problem now is to vaccinate or not vaccinate, because I think workers doesn't have enough information and are very frightened for taking the vaccine because they have seen some of the comrades die. The union was helpless for a while, but our work took on a new dimension, assisting workers to apply for the salary relief grant and other relief, such as food cards that government offered. Also trying to assist workers through WhatsApp group with information on where to source hampers and other stuff to keep them going. Not everyone still wasn't able to get assistance, especially those who found out that no national insurance was paid on their behalf. They could not receive any salary relief grant. We were able to give out the hampers, as I said, so that was a great turn for the domestic workers. So what we are saying that we want ratification of C-189, because in times of pandemic, we have no means of recourse to the treatment that had meted out to domestic workers. The lack of social protection is much more relevant for domestic workers, when many of them are often migrants and women, which increases their vulnerability. So we are very thankful for the opportunity here to express our concerns, and we call for the right to participate in the decisions that affect our lives, and the right to enjoy equal treatment and equality for all women and men. And we want to follow, according to the ILO, decent work. We want to be able, domestic workers in particular, to embrace the decent work, because decent work sums up the aspiration of people in their working lives. It involves opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize and participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and equality of opportunity and treatment for all women and men, according to the ILO. This is what decent work is all about. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Ida LeBlanc, and you never disappoint in providing us with some really important and poignant analysis of the current situation for workers. You know, we really appreciate, and I look forward to the question answer to probe a little bit more some of the analysis you've provided around the widespread impunity that we still see among workers, and the ways in which the reduction of income, job loss, and increased exploitation for domestic and low-income workers is being played out in the current environment of the pandemic. And I think this is a good segue into your presentation, Sofia, as you will provide us with your analysis of changes in the world of work within Latin America. So the floor is yours, Sofia.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I'm really honored to be sharing this panel with such wonderful women, such wonderful, strong women that we are trying to make a better world for the workers around the world. Digitalization, it's the big issue around the world of work in the last couple of years. And without a doubt, as Ida really pointed out, after the COVID-19 crisis, all workers were through to digitalization, whether they like it or not. We have seen platform workers all around the world. We have seen home office workers that could insert themselves in home office and could keep going with their task. And the digital divide was the biggest challenge for many governments in my region, because the workers that did not have any kind of workers and families who didn't have any kind of digitalization or culture in the digital tools, they couldn't keep working, their kids couldn't keep studying. So the digital divide was the big challenge for workers and for their families. The truth is that we have seen a new digital capitalism that is spreading around the world. And this digital capitalism has one raw material, which is data. And data is the raw material that we are producing as citizens, but also as workers. And surveillance in the workplace has become the normal thing to do, that the normal thing that companies do. They surveil workers not only to make disciplinary measures to put the workers in line and for them to behave in a certain way that they're expected to, but also to develop AI tools to replace those workers and to assign the task in order to become more productive. But the truth is that that productivity that you can see in the workers, it doesn't translate into their salaries, into their earnings. Yeah. Workers are becoming more productive because of AI tools and because of technology, but their salaries are not rising. In Latin America, in my region, what we have seen is that digitalization, it's being used all over the place to, as an excuse to bring out this entrepreneur discourse, this entrepreneur logic, that you are not a worker anymore, that you are on your own boss. And so it is being used to become work more precarious all around Latin America. And we have seen many governments that they are doing more flexible labor laws in order to accompany this discourse that it's spreading all over the region. And this is really problematic for many, many regions and for many, many workers, especially for women, because women are the ones who are suffering this the most. In Latin America, the digital divide is not so much about men and women not having access to internet or not having access to hardware and like computers and cell phones, because luckily we have a really equality distribution among access to technology. But the problem is the use that men and women do around the technology. Women use the technology more to communicate, while men tend to use it more for problem solving. So in the long run, men are more capable to find jobs, to keep having a job through a digital instrument than women. And women tend to use it more only for communication. So this was a really problematic throughout the pandemic, to find jobs and to keep nurturing families throughout the COVID-19 crisis. The main problem that we are facing in the region also, it's around unionization. You can see how trade unions are working a lot inside the region to try to gather the workers and to really organize them. In some countries where the trade unions are strong, like Chile, like Argentina, like Uruguay, and in some places like Brazil, you can see how the trade unions are responding to these demands and trying to tackle the entrepreneurial idea of the worker that it's spreading all over the region, and trying to organize and have a solidarity logic inside the trade unions strategies that they're building. But there are some other countries which face a totally different situation towards trade unionization, like Peru or like Colombia, where the trade union leaders are still being chased. In Colombia, we have murder of trade union leaders who are trying to build better conditions for workers. And we have had some really terrible labor laws change, like in Brazil, or for example, the home office law in Colombia or in Uruguay that was recently approved, and which is a totally flexibilization of the market, and they take out the figure of the trade union as the main institution that can take collective organizing and collective agreement towards having a better situation for workers. And in the midst of all this, we face a biggest challenge, that it's the start of building of 5G networks all over the region. We are starting to see a new communications wave that is going to change the way that we produce services all over Latin America. And in that sense, some experts at the World Economic Forum say that the biggest sectors that are going to be changed are health, education, manufacturing, and commerce and trade. And in those sectors, especially trade, health, and education, are highly feminized in Latin America. And we're going to start exporting services in Latin America in these three sectors, which are highly feminized. And what you can see in some other studies is that once a sector becomes exportable, it becomes defeminized, because men tend to stay with the high salaries in dollars, and women tend to focus on the services which serve the internal markets. And this is going to be a big challenge, because we are not solving the digital divide between the uses of the internet and the uses of the digital tools. And what we can see is that women are going to tend to be placed in the health services that are for attending local needs, while men are going to start exporting health services. And in the same will happen in education and in trade and commerce. And so this is a big challenge for the region, to try to insert women, to tackle the gender divide that we have in the region, especially between earnings and incomes. And for finishing this intervention, what I wanted to say is that the rules that they're being discussed at the WTO around trade for digital products and for digital services are not helping for the states to have funds and to have sovereignty to tackle these issues and to really address them and to try to make a strategy in order to stop the digital divide and the gender divide that we have in the region. The rules are only to become a more free trade agenda in the digital world, and that puts handcuffs to the states in order for them to make public policy around data and around the future of work that we want. And for that, we need the state intervention, and we need public policy, and we need a really strong state with a lot of funding in order to tackle the problems that we face and to reach out to the less, the more left behind citizens of our countries, in order to bring them to the digital world and to develop digital tools inside the region. So this is the message I wanted to leave around the future of work in Latin America and the hazards that we're facing around digitalization and platformization of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sofia, and thank you for really laying bare and exposing this myth about how good digitization is for workers and for work in general. In particular, your reference to digital capitalism and this way of positioning workers who are in rather precarious position as entrepreneurs and what that means, and giving us some insights into the gendered ways in which these arrangements operate. And I really look forward in the question and answer to probing a bit more of your insights on how we tackle what we are seeing as you know, the absence of trade trade unionism in some spaces, sort of leading to a situation for workers that is far more dangerous. The example you gave from Brazil in particular, I think we would love to hear more about how do we reverse that trend in the current setting. And with that, I really now look forward to giving you the floor, Anita, to share your insights on e-commerce and gender-just economies.
My presentation will focus on the connection between e-commerce and how, in this particular conjuncture of platformization and digitization, as Sofia said, we could aspire towards gender-just economies. What is also very important about this forum is that this happens to be the first ever UNCTAD Gender and Development Forum. To get into the topic of e-commerce and lay out the landscape from a feminist perspective, I'd like to start off by saying that a radically different society imagined in the promise of digital technologies may indeed be a valid aspiration, but as we heard from our previous speakers, our shared lives belie any optimism in this regard, at least so far. As we will see, the processes and the end results of economic valorization in the digital paradigm are antithetical to sustainable feminist futures. It would be logical to begin with the e-commerce landscape after COVID. Even amidst a slowing down of economic activity with the pandemic, there has been a surge in e-commerce with its share in global retail trade estimated to have increased from 14% in 2019 to 17% in 2020. For instance, in Latin America and Africa, transactions for goods on the leading regional e-commerce platforms, Mercado Libre and Jumia, doubled in 2020 from their pre-pandemic baseline levels. While trade and services in overall did badly over 20 and 21, the one class of services that held up relatively well was communication and business services, such as finance and insurance. These are, as we know, easily deliverable remotely and through digital means. Undoubtedly, the pandemic has accelerated the digitalization of global trade in goods and services, and this trend is here to stay. The gendered implications of this shift need to be urgently unpacked so that our conversations about building back better are tuned to ground realities, the realities that Ida spoke about, and the intent to leave no woman behind does not remain an empty rhetoric. To begin with, the story of women in e-commerce is much more complex than what techno-optimists would have us believe. Currently, women own or manage about 20% of export firms worldwide, and a third of the world's micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. There's some evidence that in both trade in goods and services, the online marketplace has enabled a greater share of women entrepreneurs to participate than traditional offline businesses. This is true even for developing countries, despite the gender divides in connectivity. In Africa, for instance, 75% of the firms trading exclusively through e-commerce are women-owned. 55% of the host community on Airbnb are women, and more than half of all online shops on Alibaba are owned by women. But women's presence in e-commerce does not automatically translate into market participation based on fair value. E-commerce marketplaces controlled by transnational digital corporations are hugely exploitative. Algorithmic opacity in product rankings create information asymmetries or moral hazards in which the seller is at the mercy of the platform. As one beauty and wellness worker working with Urban Company, a Bangalore-based online service company, told us in our research, before the pandemic, for 1 hour massage, Urban Company used to deduct 13 credits, that is 130 INR as commission charges. Now they deduct 24 credits, that's 240 INR. When we asked, they said the business is expanding and so they have increased the commission. But how price is fixed for each customer, we don't know at all. Commissions of over 40% on sales and product packaging and stock replenishment conditionalities are simply too difficult for women's enterprises to sustain. The majority of these enterprises tend to be small-sized businesses with low output levels, limited growth potential, and thin price margins, with very little capacity to bear the inventory and customer service demands to succeed in the mainstream e-commerce marketplace, which is why it's unsurprising that although women-led firms account for half of all firms selling on Alibaba, their average sales are lower than sales of their male-led counterparts. On an average, the sales revenue of women-led firms is 18% lower than that of firms led by men. We also need much more research and macro statistics on how women-run businesses fare online, especially in the post-pandemic context. In the accelerated digitalization of global value chains, which also Sofia spoke about in her reference to digital capitalism, gendered labor hierarchies are entrenched rather than challenged. We are witnessing not just the expansion of e-commerce or platform marketplaces, rather, the platform model signals a deep transformation of production relations. This shift has not augured well at all for women. It is expected that automation in developed countries will increase low-skilled and high-skilled employment at the cost of middle-skilled labor that women dominate. This means we can expect to see a rollback of historical gains for women, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world. For women in the global South, historically concentrated in agriculture and the informal economy, the future seems even bleaker. In platform-mediated online jobs, just about 2 in 10 workers from developing countries are women, and they tend to be concentrated mostly in low-paid, repetitive micro work. A 2020 research report by ODI demonstrates how the platformization of agricultural value chains in developing countries and the entry of ag tech or agri-tech platforms may actually exacerbate gender divides in agricultural productivity. This is not only because of the gender digital divides that prevent women farmers from accessing such platforms, but also institutional constraints, such as lack of formal ownership documents and access to working capital that become very important in terms of signing contracts with platform service providers to be guaranteed market and logistics services. The platform paradigm deepens global inequality in labor chains, excluding and simply expelling small and marginal actors with devastating impacts for women. Automation in the garment sector, the apparel and garment sector, and reshoring trends are already pushing vast numbers of women in countries like Bangladesh into unemployment, with cascading effects for entire supply chains, a trend that has worsened with the pandemic. Platformization must also be grasped for the data and AI power aggrandized by e-commerce companies. First movers backed by venture capital funds that effectively hollow out local production capacity, triggering and reinforcing de-industrialization and blatantly undermining labor rights. As our research at ID for Change found, Indian women working for global digital work platforms such as Amazon Mechanical Turk are caught precariously between a rock and a hard place. Their work online has shrunk, but they cannot give up. With the pandemic creating pressures for the household's survival, they must stay up long hours just watching the screen, watching their account, and waiting for work to come their way. Many of the women fear that they may be deplatformed anytime without any explanation. The acceleration of digitalization also exacerbates the marketization of public services and deepens the crisis of care. Services which were previously less trade intensive and mainly the preserve of the public sector, such as education and health, are being platformized. Ed tech and digital health sectors are booming with investments. Digitization has meant a de facto marketization of services that were mainly public, directly disenfranchising the poorest women. Precarious gigs also mean that with a living wage no longer guaranteed, women workers are perpetually hustling. Gendered dispossession in the global digital economy thrives not only by extracting women's digital labor for profit, but also obscuring the care work they must perform in the ostensible flexibility afforded by platform capitalism. The sad truth is that policy discussions seem to ignore these realities. Powerful countries want, as Sofia pointed out, a hyper-liberalization of e-commerce and goods and services. They want data to flow freely. This is the only way nascent global value chains predicated on data, which is the key resource in the fourth industrial revolution, can be captured by the advanced economies of the North. Data extractivism by platform lead firms from the North is bound to reproduce economic inequality within and between countries, entrenching gendered labor hierarchies and intensifying the capitalist exploitation of the sphere of production and social reproduction. This forum is expected to come up with the Bridgetown Declaration on Gender, Trade, and Development. And from IT for Change, I would like to make certain recommendations that this declaration must carry. The declaration must reject the plurilateral process within the WTO, which is bound to hasten the hyperliberalization of digital trade and the dominant platform economy that is so inimical to gender equality. It must call for the preservation of policy space of developing countries and small island and developing countries so that they can embrace their own digital industrialization pathways. They can regulate big tech, and they can protect and promote access to decent work and labor mobility for women. The declaration must affirm a digital economy that is sustainable and non-extractivist, grounded in fair and equitable distribution of data value, and solidarity economy models led by women. For example, e-commerce marketplaces managed by producer cooperatives. The declaration must resolve to work towards a UN tax convention that addresses tax avoidance by digital companies. Digital taxation is vital for the fiscal revenue base of developing countries and their social and care infrastructure. And finally, the declaration must demand that by 2031, at least 10% of ODA to LDCs should focus on supporting the development of autonomous connectivity, autonomous platform, and autonomous data and AI infrastructures for these countries. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Anita. And again, another really critical, analytical presentation. And thank you so much for providing us with those insights for the Bridgetown Declaration. We take note of what you've presented here. And just to kind of draw a thread running through the presentations and to ask each of you panelists to speak to the particular issue you raised towards the end of your presentation, Anita, but connects throughout all the presentation, is this issue of the acceleration of this digitization and how it sort of exacerbates marketization, as you said, of public services, but that it deepens the crisis of care. So I was wondering if you could all expand a bit more on the crisis of care that we are currently seeing manifested. Either you spoke in your presentation about the ways in which the crisis of care gets amplified for women domestic workers who are being asked to serve under some very precarious and exploitative conditions. And in your presentation, Sofia, you also addressed the issue as it relates to the growing absence in some countries of the influence of unions and what this might actually mean for the conditions of work, the increased precarity. So if you could each, from your own perspective, provide an analysis of how the crisis of care is being played out across the area of digitization as it relates to low-income workers, but also as it relates to, the role of trade unions in addressing these issues. And you can go first, Anita, as the question was sort of raised from what you presented last. Thanks.
I think there are many dimensions to this crisis of care, and I stand on the shoulders of the tremendous work that feminists have done in order to benefit from the perspectives. From a macroeconomic lens, it can easily be seen that big tech companies, by evading tax, by evading all kinds of responsibilities that they have, obligations with absolute impunity, deprive developing countries from that crucial access to revenue that pays for our social infrastructure and care infrastructure. From that level to the innumerable stories we have heard today in this panel about the extent of pressures women at the household level face with the pandemic and the double duty and triple duty they are performing, reflects a story that's vastly different from what we are often led to believe, that there's so much flexibility, that kind of mythification of the gig economy, right? So this precarity has led us to a point where the definition of work and worker itself somehow stands completely problematized. And I think international institutions like the ILO, the policy-making bodies at the national level, all of these bureaucracies have to really contend with a certain definition of work, employment, and worker that is adequate to the current moment. The second context of this crisis of care is also that the wonderful world of data can be used to socialize the value of data. But instead, I think the value capture of data for the purposes of capitalism leads to a crisis whereby there is a certain automatic connection between digitization and making services marketable, right? So Sofia was pointing out about how suddenly when things become very useful for exports and for the market, it gets defeminized. So I think that we're seeing a cascading influence in the economy where alienation and atomization have reached a level like never before. And this is of a very unique order. You can't see your employer, you're working online, or you're doing your gigs for an employer where your jobs appear on your mobile phone, you click accept. And if you actually have an issue or a grievance, including issues of sexual exploitation, there's absolutely nowhere to go, right? So this is disenfranchisement of rights at many levels, including in a new category of deprivation of data and digital rights. I will stop here.
Thank you, Anita. And if I could hear from Ida and Sofia on the same question.
Well, what I have to say about this care work, which is mostly done by women, we have a few men coming into this type of work, is that, everybody expects women to do it. They feel that is something natural for women to do. That is why it is so low paid and in some cases unpaid. So that is why we have been celebrating time off for women. And also now it has turned into the global women's strike, because we are trying to let women understand the importance of all these work that we do in our house for no pay at all. And when we go out there and do it is for low pay. That all this have to be stopped, because this is valuable work that we are doing, And we have to be treated as workers, because still in our country, they are not treated as workers, caregivers, because the law says that anybody who works in and around the house and paid by a householder is not a worker. So when you go into private homes and do this work, you come like it, well, you're under the minimum wage, and this work is looked upon as nothing, which is so important. Because we are taking care of everyone, from toddlers to the elderly, and in this where we living in this dimension now, where they say by 2030 how much people will be needing care for the elderly. The elderly will be needing care. We should put more importance on that work that women are doing, because care work is not just going to care. It have different dimensions on what people have to do. Because it have people just want to hire people to sit with them, be a companion, all that fall under care. They have people who are to come in the home now, give them insulin, give them different medication, make sure they get it on time. because if they don't do that, next thing they will get fired. And the whole, if they get on the newspaper, they look at you as some monster, you know, because we have to get more training for these workers who go out there and take care of the family, of people's family and things like that. So that is my take on it, and that the ILO must do more to assist domestic workers and caregivers in every country that they are in. Yes.
Thank you, Ida. And Sofia, your thoughts?
My thoughts. Well, I think we have seen a feminism like never before in the last couple of years, especially in my region in Latin America, where feminism has been the resistance of many political scenarios that were really against workers and against civil rights. And I am really proud of the feminisms that we built in Latin America. And one of the problem that we face is that digitalization and the pandemic strike before we solve some discussions in the region, like the co-responsibility of work inside the houses. And so we find a lot of women who had to start doing home office and taking care of the children in the midst of a pandemic, and being teachers and mothers and workers all at the same time. This was really, really hard for many of them, and many had to drop their professional careers or their working lives. And one thing that in the regions started to be discussed is the professionalization of care work, not only as health, but as all the care, and how we need more care networks inside the region to sustain women, because we haven't solved the discussion around the co-responsibility of the responsibilities that we have inside the house. And in some countries, like in Argentina, we even started recognizing the rights of women, that they stay at home and took care of their families their entire lives, and they now have a pension, for example, because of having done so. And this, I think those are really big steps, but we haven't solved that, and digitalization strike in the middle. And that's why we need public tools. We need public tools to support the feminist debates. So if feminism keeps debating the professionalization of care work, if they keep debating the co-responsibility, if they keep debating how we need more women inside care jobs that are more productive and that they should be paid more, if we are going to face home office as a new reality for many workers, we need to give those women tools in order for them, when the debates start blossom, they can make the changes that they need to be done. So for example, I see a lot of home office laws becoming a reality in the region, but I don't see so much, for example, the reversibility principle in the laws. This means that women, maybe they choose to do home office, to stay home and take care of the kids. But then if the reality changes and that woman wants to get back to their job in a presence way, they can't, because they can't choose otherwise. We don't leave the door open for them to get out there and start building their careers again. So we need more feminist debates. We need the professionalization of care working all around the region. We need care networks in order to support the women. And we need public tools in order to strike the digital divide, and also for the changes to become a reality when the time comes and the debates are done. And so I really think we need a state that accompanies the feminist movement in the region, because they have done so much, and the debates are really getting to a point where they're starting to blossom, but we need public policies to accompany those changes. That's what I think around the crisis that we're seeing in the midst of this pandemic, where women suffer the most.
Thank you, Sophia. And there's so many questions in my mind based on the very rich answers you're providing to some of these questions. And I wanted to pose two areas, and any of you are free to respond. And the first has to do with how care work in particular is defined as work. And that within, feminist conversations about care as work and care as affect, how is this sort of thinking affecting the ways in which not just the state, but social networks, women's movements, women's organizations might be thinking about positioning care, especially when you talk, for instance, about the professionalization of care. What might it mean to professionalize care and constructed solely as work, and what happens to the affective dimension of care, which women often talk about in their own discussion of domestic work, care, and sometimes called emotion work. And the second issue I wanted to discuss, and as we look ahead to the Bridgetown Declaration, is the ways in which artificial intelligence, automation is often defined and constructed as, these tools, digitization, these tools that are supposed to facilitate and create opportunities and even out the space, even out the labor market. But yet the actual creation of AI, automation, digitization, excludes large groups of society. It excludes racialized groups, groups racialized as Black, Indigenous people, women in particular. And what might it mean for tools to be created in such a way and to be used in such a way that creates these other layers of inequality? And I say this in a context where I would like for you to reflect on the actual creation of these tools, the application of these tools, and as we look forward to democratize the space of digitization and AI. So it's really two questions, and you're free to sort of speak to both of them, the one on digitization and the first one on how we kind of conceive of care in the context where we are looking at the future of work, where it might we might be sort of silent on particular dimensions of care.
Well, if you want, I can start.
Yes, please do, Sophia.
Yeah, well, about the professionalization of care, what I do think is that we need to recognize the effort that they have done their entire life. Mm-hmm. Pension systems should really recognize all the work that women had done throughout their entire life to sustain the capitalist system and to sustain workers' mm-hmm. life in order for the children to become workers for the economy. So this is the first step that we need to do. But the second step that it's really important is for the state to start providing a care network in all countries. I know some countries do have it, but most of them do not. And women do not find any help with their kids and with their families. And they have to support all the care work by themselves. And so the professionalization of the care work means that we need to have places where to leave our children. And those women women or men that are going to be taking care of the families, they should be getting paid and they should have a career to be made out of that, because that's what we need. We need economy that takes care of the children. For example, in Argentina, the home office law says that if you have children on your family, you get to choose in which schedules you want to do home office, because we assume that you have to take care of your children if you stay at home. And so these are really big, important steps to put care at the center of the economy and not as something that it's done in silence and not getting paid and not being recognized by the economy. We need to really take care of this. This is a sustainable economy that put cares in the center, and that we first as societies find a solution about how to take care of our elderly and about our children. And this is what we should be taking care of. About AI systems that you ask, I really think that the biggest problem with AI is not so much about the the bias that has. The biggest problem that we face in AI is that we don't find a way to regulate it. And we don't find a way to regulate it because it's a totally black box. It's a black box that is protected by IP policies. We have seen throughout the pandemic with vaccines, for example, how intellectual property can cause really big problems for all the humanity in something so simple as a vaccine. And imagine what it's doing in AI, where there's these black boxes that we cannot regulate, where we don't know what it's inside. We don't know if it's biased intentionally or accidentally. We just don't know what's going on in there. And so in that sense, we need to create a new culture around AI based on open source, based on data for public good, and with a different logic, a logic that puts people first and public policy first. And we need to develop intelligent regulations around AI. And we cannot, the humanity cannot assume the risk of having a black box of AI governing workers' lives and governing our lives in general with these AI systems that are being developed. And I think that's the biggest problem. It's not so much about the bias, it's how we regulate the bias, because bias is going to exist nonetheless, whether we like it or not. And so I think that's the main point. That's what we need to discuss inside the WTO and in some other regulatory spaces. So those are my thoughts.
All right. So that I'm saying that our organization, we have a lot of members who are caregivers. And these caregivers, most of them are involved with the government program, the geriatric adolescent program, the GAP, they call it the GAP program, where they send out women to work at people's home, where they have elderly existing. And they're supposed to be ready for poor people, But people in all kind of different jobs who could afford caregiving for their parents, is usually for their parents. They seek out that. So the people who really doing low-income jobs and need somebody to take care of the family back home, they don't get that kind of assistance. It always go to the wrong people. I'm not saying they shouldn't get it, but they're working for sufficient money to take care of the elderly parents and things like that. So that is one of the things happening there. Now you have to have a certificate. We're not sure about the certificate, what they went and do, what was the curriculum and what they teach them to do. Because just as the certificate in child care and geriatric. So that we never see a syllabus of what these workers really doing in when they go for training because when people say caregiving, most of the time they're talking about geriatric people, the elderly, so that we had a webinar last week, and one of our caregivers spoke and our housekeeper spoke to let people know what was going on with them in COVID time. And one of the things that the caregiver was saying, they have so much interaction with the family of the person. Sometimes that put a dent in the relationship and change up things when these people could be living happy in the last days, you have to say. And some families really don't know how to treat the elderly. So it is a savior sometimes with these caregivers who may learn and know more about caregiving and things about caregiving and who have the ability to read and watching a caregiving in a different light. Not just going to take care of them and give them some tea or feed them. The whole issue of care and the relationship with the person that you come there to take care of. Sometimes the family intervention, they say, is very terrible. Sometimes you go there just to take care of the person and they want you to do the housework. Or sometimes they find you get too close with the elderly in times where they might be living in some big house, the woman living, she might have wealth or whatever. They're very careful with you, and always mistrusting you and things like that. If they get too friendly with you. Now, if something happens to these caregivers and they end up in the hospital, as we have a case, it's always you they blame. They don't take into account this is an elderly person, and things wouldn't work too good, the body not 100% anymore and things like that. And they treat caregivers with so much scorn. Some people, not everybody in that way. We have good people in this world. So that we have to watch it. We have to more, I don't know what word to call for it, but people need to be trained. The caregivers need to be trained in the different avenues that they might have to take. As I said, it might be some people go there and just be a companion, then it have people who have to give out medicine, it have people to do, you have to stay up all night because the person cannot sleep. This is hard work, So that is why we, in Trinidad and Tobago, people who are in the union and who know about the union, associated with the union, they know that you have to, it's $250 for day to work in the day and $300 for the night. Now we also have all these caregiving places all over, and they are subsidized by the government. Now these people so want to make money, they want to pay you the minimum wage, so they take anybody to come in there to give care. You was never trained, so that they can give you the minimum wage. They can give you $150 a day to work for these elderly people. So sometimes usually they don't get the proper care. So you see, this is the thing that where we believe that there is where government should join up with the partners, people who doing care, who taking care of the union, who is hearing all the complaints from caregivers. We have to sit down and talk and see how best we can go forward with caregivers, if it has to be institutionalized, what we have to do. Because it's not until we have to talk and we can know where we're going from. Dialogue, social dialogue is so important in this time, so that we can go through a clear road. Don't reach somewhere and then say, oh, I should have done this or that. Let us sit down and have social dialogue together and see where to go. But if we should say that in public, when they do have social dialogue, we wouldn't be part of it, because we speak out too much, and make certain people look bad when we speak and all that. So we are always left out of these tripartite meetings and all that. We have to depend on the trade union centers now to speak for us. And when we speak and tell people what is going on with the problems of workers, the narrative always changes when it goes to the table where you have to sit and make decisions on how to move forward. So this is our big problem in our country, and I'm sure it's a problem in many countries.
Thank you.
Because what happened here is no different to what's happening in many, many countries with respect to domestic workers and caregivers. Because we involve in the International Domestic Workers Federation, and from time to time we will have meetings and hear what's happening in different countries, and it's no different to what is happening here. It is a kind of globalization thing amongst these people who hire domestic and caregivers. They do the same thing. So that is what I have to say. I didn't really prepare for the questions.
Thank you so much, Isabelle, for making those links with what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago. But that reminding us about the global sort of implications as it relates to migrant workers and others. And Anita, if you could also respond to the questions, but also give like your closing thoughts as we look to you've already given us some salient points towards the ends of your presentation on the Bridgetown Declaration. So if you could respond to the questions if there's anything that you want to elaborate on, but also point us to your conclusions. And Sofia, I'll give you 30 seconds to conclude, to provide some concluding remark as well as you. Ida, we're out of time, so unfortunately I have to keep it to 30 seconds each. Go ahead, Anita.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to take a question on AI and the fact that the world today is defined through the behavioral surplus that is extracted from us and represented back in the form of models, you know, is actually a very scary place to be. And as Sofia rightly pointed out, the advancement in science and technology is something that's part of, I think, or that's intrinsic to the DNA of human endeavor, right? What's really important is the ethics and the models that need to be coded into these frameworks require a governance arrangement. And in that regard, I'd like to point out that the regulation of AI, which is a point that was already made by Sofia, will also have to be accompanied by ideas of what are digital and data rights. And there, I think it would really be important that at a global level, with respect to workers, we are able to define ideas of how far this business of surveillance can go. A lot of governments in the past couple of weeks have been talking about the Pegasus spyware, and people have called attention to the fact that we should simply ban certain kinds of innovations, like the way in which facial recognition technologies easily, you know, frame people that are of a particular race or a particular caste, right? So it's vital that the no-go areas are clear in AI regulation. Similarly, it's equally important to have data rights, a body of rights that individuals in their various roles as citizens and as workers should have. The rights that should inhere in a woman worker whose right it is not to be observed and tracked and monitored all the time, right? So the disciplining that was spoken earlier in this session has devastating consequences because you're constantly observed, you know, and there is a certain average that is computed, which is dehumanizing, right? So if you don't perform so many jobs in such and such a time frame, in this limited duration, then you're pushed and nudged, or you're penalized. So these kind of technologies have to really be closely, I think, scrutinized by the worker movements worldwide. And I think it's vital also for the AI framework to be appropriated for purposes that has already been referred to as AI for the good, in which the politics of AI is really defined by the most marginalized.
Thank you so much, Anita. And like I said, Sofia, your 30 seconds closing remarks as it relates to the look ahead to the Bridgetown Declaration.
In 30 seconds, what I can say is that if we want to build a better world of work, an inclusive world of work for everybody, we need a more powerful state. We need corporates to pay taxes. We need digitalization, focus on the people, and we need more democracy. That's what we need. Otherwise, it will be just digitalization for a few, and digitalization will be used for to create more precarious jobs. So what I do think is that we need more democracy and more social dialogue among all in the construction of a new digital world.
Thank you, thank you. And in your 30 seconds, Ida.
Yes. Well, all I can say is that we want decent work. Decent work will cover a lot, the exploitation and things that hamper domestic and caregivers. so that we could all live better lives, you know? And we need also the help of academics, I must say, to help us with the way forward. You know, don't change our narrative, but understand where we want to go and help us in this course, because it's not an easy road we are traveling on now. Because just recently, I had a housekeeper, not a caregiver, a housekeeper who the employer's wife, husband, put her camera and was watching her all in the bathroom and in the toilet. And when she drew it to the attention of his wife, thinking that she would get some support, she was fired instead. So, you know, we want some more understanding from people who know better or supposed to know better. And we are all women together, and let us go the course to help women down below, because they need the help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ida, and thank you all for joining us today and for your very wonderful insights, your very critical insights on the future of work. And we look forward to hearing more in the sessions ahead. Thank you.